the final use, at least for some of the hostages, is going to be literally as a human shield and a bargaining chip.
Hello, I'm Stig Abel. Welcome to Frontline on Times Radio. Today we're speaking to the military historian Saul David about the conflict in Gaza and how Israel will seek to rescue or recover the more than 200 hostages taken in Hamas's terrorist attack on the 7th of October. Saul David is a Sunday Times bestselling military historian, novelist, and broadcaster. Got a huge range of topics he's an expert in, but he did write a book on one of Israel's most famous hostage rescue operations, which I think is in lots of people's minds when they consider the issue of Israel and hostages, which is the Entebbe Raid, which has a personal connection with Benjamin Netanyahu as well, which we'll get to. Good morning to you, Saul. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Tell us about this and set the context. Tell us about the Entebbe Raid, because some people will know a little bit about it. Some people may never have heard of it. When did it happen? What did Israel notably do in it?
Summer of 1976, an Air France jet with about 250 people on board took off from Tel Aviv and importantly stopped in Athens on the way to Paris. And the reason Athens is relevant to the story is because that's where the terrorists got on, and they were able to get on at Athens because security was pretty lax there. So on the flight between Athens and Paris, they took over the plane using weapons, grenades, and were able to then divert the flight, first of all, to Libya, where it refueled, all pre-planned, and then on down to Entebbe Airport in Uganda, where also I discovered during the research for the book, the Ugandans were expecting them. Idi Amin had pivoted from his earlier support for Israel, or at least alliance with Israel, loose alliance, to when he wasn't getting what he wanted from them, which is mainly military kit, he turned full circle and really became pro-Arab. And as part of that, the Palestinian cause was then something that he adopted. Now, the plan really was for the terrorists, two of them were German, the other two were Palestinian, to force the Israelis to release an awful lot of freedom fighters, mainly in Israel, but also some in France and Germany. And in return, they would release the hostages, about 250. So the question the Israelis had, both the politicians and the military, is what are we going to do about this? Well, their policy on the whole at this time was not to negotiate with terrorists, but that was a very loose policy. And there had been instances where they were prepared to do that. And in a nutshell, it came down to this. If the military felt they had an operation, a rescue operation that had a chance of succeeding, that would be enough for the politicians to authorize that operation. And what's interesting about the Entebbe week, because it takes place on a Sunday, the initial hijacking, and the operation to free them is then a week later. That's on the following Sunday. And during that week, that very tense week in Israel, where, of course, the families were, very emotive scenes in Israel, the families of the hostages were trying to pressure the government into caving into the terrorists and releasing all these freedom fighters, or terrorists, of course, as the Israelis would have called them. There's this pivoting, or this yo-yoing between can we actually put together a plan that has any chance of succeeding? And if you think about it, Stig, I mean, the chances of the Entebbe operation succeeding were pretty low. They had to fly 2,000 miles. They eventually decided to go there in transport planes because, of course, they needed to take a certain amount of kit with them. And they would then use this very secret rescue force known as Sayeret Matkal, which is the equivalent of our SAS, who would then go in, break into the old terminal building in Entebbe where the terrorists were being held, and release them. But of course, the thought uppermost in the Israeli government's mind is what happens if this fails? First of all, we lose the cream of our special forces. And secondly, an awful lot of hostages are going to die. So that's really the key calculation. Can we carry out this operation and with the minimum loss of life? And it's a sort of knife-edge decision. Of course, nobody knows for sure. And that's exactly the same thought that's going to be going through the Israeli government's mind at the moment.
And tell us about the Netanyahu connection, because that's quite important in all of this. Obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu, now the much reviled prime minister of Israel, having to make decisions about the conduct of the war, how to deal with the hostages, for which he is shipping an awful lot of criticism. But before we get on to the modern day, what's his connection to Entebbe?
Well, Bibi Netanyahu's brother, Yoni, his elder brother, was commanding Sayeret Matkal, otherwise known as the unit. This is the unit that's going to go in and release the hostages. You should also bear in mind there were an awful lot of other soldiers involved. The Golani were there, the paratroopers too at Entebbe, but the tip of the spear, as it was known, was Sayeret Matkal. And interestingly enough, Bibi himself had been a member of Sayeret Matkal even before his brother Yoni, and Bibi had also taken part in a hostage rescue, the famous Sabina hijacking. That was at Lod Airport, later Ben Gurion Airport. And Sayeret Matkal, including Bibi, had actually stormed that aircraft and successfully released about 90 hostages. They did lose one of the hostages, killed in the crossfire. That's always a possible calculation. And Bibi himself actually was shot in the bicep, I think, accidentally by one of the other Sayeret Matkal commandos. But getting back to Yoni for a second, Yoni is now Bibi never commanded Sayeret Matkal. Yoni eventually rose to the command, and in 1976, it's very interesting in the research for my book. He's effectively a poet warrior. This is a very, very bright intellectual man. He was actually educated at Harvard, who's decided and easily could have stayed in America. And Bibi himself was in America when the Entebbe operation was taking place. And what's ironic about the Entebbe operation is that but for Yoni's death, and he was the only Israeli soldier to be killed in that operation, killed on the tarmac just as the rescue teams were going into the building to release the hostages. But for that, Bibi's political career probably would not have taken off. He's effectively a martyr for Israel. And all of a sudden, this relatively obscure family, the Netanyahu family, who came from the right of Israeli politics, is suddenly catapulted into front and center into Israeli press. And ultimately, of course, Bibi uses it as a springboard for his political career. So the whole business of hostage rescue is something Bibi knows himself, but also you could argue that but for his brother's death, he never would have been in the position of prime minister.
And this is important context in lots of ways, as you've just said. But one of the reputations Israel has got is they're willing to go get hostages, possibly more than any other country in the world. They have expertise in it, they have experience in it, and they have a certain attitude towards it, which is if we can get them through military means, we'll go after them.
Well, they understand very well the danger of terrorist blackmail. It tends, if you give in one time, it's going to keep happening again. And you say that's Israel's attitude, and indeed it is, but it's also an attitude that was taken up by a lot of the other Western governments as a result of Entebbe, actually, and also some of the other previous operations I've mentioned. There was, I should add, a disastrous operation at Marlot in the north of Israel in 1974, when again Sayeret Matkal are deputed to rescue hostages, in this case school children who were in a single building that had been taken over by Palestinian terrorists. And they make a complete balls up of that. And scores of the school children are killed in the operation. And they're determined never again, never again. So they refine their tactics, the use of endless practicing, a bit like the SAS do at Hereford these days, going into a building and identifying the right targets. The so-called killing house at Hereford is where you go in and you see who's friendly and who's not friendly. And this is something Sayeret Matkal had to refine again and again and again. And of course, they will still be using those tactics today. But what's different about Marlot in 1974, Sabina in 72, and Entebbe in 76, compared to the situation now, is that the hostages were all in one place, or as far as Israeli intelligence was concerned, they were all in a single location. What we gather from the situation in Gaza at the moment is that, very sensibly, I suppose, if you're going to talk from a tactical point of view, Hamas have made sure that the terrorists have been diffused. They've been put in lots and lots of different locations, and therefore it's almost impossible to carry out a simultaneous hostage rescue situation, which is really the key to all hostage rescues, because it's a race against time. When the planes landed in Entebbe, they reckon they had 3 minutes. I mean, imagine that. They've got to get off the plane in vehicles, race to the terminal. They reckon they've got 3 minutes to carry out the rescue. And if it's any longer, the terrorists are going to start killing the hostages. And that's always the big threat in these situations.
And that is actually the point is such a good one that it's not clear that Israel knows even where all the hostages are. They're very legitimately cautious about saying what they do and don't know. We know they've rescued one. They've rescued a soldier called Ori Megadishu, who they managed to get out, but they won't talk about how they did it. So as far as the lessons of Entebbe and what you feel they might be doing, they presumably, if possible, will be thinking, let's get some people out militarily, but there's no guarantee they can get them all out or they can get a chunk of them out at the same time. That's the big issue for them.
They made a calculation at Entebbe, and I think they do this every time, that if they lost 25%, the then Prime Minister Rabin went on the record. I mean, he's gone on the record, well, or at least he said to his chief advisor, and I interviewed the chief advisor for the book, a man called Iran, and Iran told me that Rabin had said to him off the record, if we lose 25%, under 25%, that's a result as far as we're concerned, because they're seeing the bigger picture, Stig, as I said, this, if you give in one time, it'll keep coming back. So you need to be robust in their view in the way you deal with terrorists, and they're prepared to lose 25%. I suspect in the current situation, given the difficulty of rescuing the hostages and given their absolute determination, or at least so they claim, that they must and will eradicate Hamas, whatever that means. I mean, it's hard to sort of calculate in your own mind exactly what that means, because that's let's face it, that's a pretty tricky job to carry out. I suspect that calculation of 25% is higher. I think they will, in their own minds, have accepted that they're going to. I mean, it's an awful thing to say, but I think the reality of this situation is they probably imagine they're going to lose more. If they know the location of any of those hostages for sure, and of course they can be moved. I mean, one of the things that, again, will be happening is they're probably being moved constantly. But if they know for sure from any intelligence, then they probably will act on it, because they will assume that they're going to die anyway. One of the huge advantages at Entebbe, and the mistake made by the terrorists, is that they released some of the hostages in two batches. In fact, they released about 40 a couple of days in and another 100 a few days later, and really ended up with only chiefly the Israeli hostages and a few Americans and a couple of the French crew of the plane. And these releases allowed the Israeli intelligence, Mossad, and their military to gather intelligence about what the terminal building looked like and where everyone was and how many terrorists there were there and where the windows were and all those sort of crucial bits of information you need. And we know that some hostages have been released. I think I last heard, I mean, maybe you've heard more information than me, Stig. I last heard that they'd released 4, which is a tiny number, of course. And that's not really going to be providing vital intelligence about where the majority of the hostages are, I suspect.
Especially if they're all in a different place. So, what one person says about where they were captured in prison may have no relevance to where the other 200 were. This is an invidious subject, but I think we have to speak as frankly as we possibly can here, Saul, which is it possible that in this situation, in Entebbe, the risk was they could just start shooting hostages? The purpose of the Hamas hostage taking in this instance isn't clear, actually. Are they trying to inflame Israel, to make Israel make a tactical mistake, to make Israel lose the support of their Western allies because of how they're reacting to October 7th? And if that is a tactical purpose of Hamas, they're less likely to kill hostages, because then they start shifting some of the views of the wider world. Or are we overthinking this? I mean, are hostages there to be killed? I mean, I don't want to be, it's so horrible for anyone connected to them, but I suppose we have to try and work out what the prospects of being killed are. In that Entebbe situation, they had 3 minutes or they'd start shooting the hostages. The idea of shooting the hostages felt like a very clear and present danger. Is it the same, do you think, with these hostages taken in these circumstances?
Well, it's interesting that even in Entebbe, they made that calculation, and without going into too many details, mistakes were made by the Israelis, by Yoni himself, in fact, as they approached the terminal building. And that actually gave the terrorists enough time to, if they'd chosen to, begin killing the hostages. And it's interesting that a man called Wilfried Börzer, who was a member of the Revolutionary Cells, this German, extreme left-wing German terrorist organization. I mean, think Baader-Meinhof. They were kind of loosely aligned to Baader-Meinhof. Berza made the decision actually not to kill the terrorists. And I interviewed one of the other founders of the revolutionary cells who told me he wasn't a killer. He wasn't interested in killing. He was interested in getting people out of jail, including Bader Meinhof in Germany, and that was his main motivation. Now, he was no shrinking violet. I mean, this is a man prepared. He was a terrorist. He was prepared to use violence. But when push came to shove, they actually made, and there's no doubt about this, they made a decision not to kill the hostages, and all the terrorists at Entebbe were killed by Israeli special forces. The scenario in Gaza is much more complicated. I mean, as you say, there are probably multiple different reasons why they took the hostages. They always take hostages because they're useful, frankly. You can use them to negotiate, but they can also use them in effect as human shields. I think if we forget about the hostage taking for a second and just imagine that the killings had taken place and they hadn't taken any hostages, the Israelis are still going to be as utterly determined as they are to have gone into Gaza. So the taking of hostages is not going to stop the Israelis going into Gaza. It's a bargaining tool. And the interesting thing is a lot of them are international. They're not all, just Israelis. They're dual citizens, just as they were on the plane at Entebbe. And what happened with a lot of those dual citizens? They were released first, and they kept the Israelis. So possibly we're going to see some of that in the next few days, the next week or two. But it does seem that events are moving fast now. The Israelis have already made their initial incursion into, particularly into the north of the Gaza Strip, and as a result, every hostage's life is now in danger. But just to my own personal view is I don't think they're going to start killing hostages. Some hostages will be killed in the crossfire, almost certainly, because they may already have been. Certainly, Hamas has claimed that some have already died as a result of the bombing and this so-called precision bombing, which as we both know can never be that precision when it's coming from the air. The Israeli Air Force, by the way, does have a history of thinking it can do the job on its own. It tried to do something similar in 2006 in Lebanon, and got a lot of egg on its face as a result. I mean, we all know, I think, from the Second World War that it's a pretty blunt instrument. And even with the technology that they have, there is going to be a lot of collateral damage. So some hostages will probably have already died as a result of that. But I doubt very much that the Hamas are going to start killing hostages as a matter of course, unless they get to kind of final redoubt situation where they literally use that as a form of blackmail. Stop attacking or they're all going to die. And that of course is possible. Again, it's a sort of horrendously grim thought. But it strikes me that the Israelis are so determined to carry out this operation that yes, if they get a chance, they'll try and release the hostages. And yes, the fact that they're dual nationality means that there will be international pressure on them. But still, I feel that their single-minded purpose is to try and get all senior Hamas. And if they lose hostages in an attempt to do that's probably a price they're willing to pay, grim as it sounds.
Explain the foreign action. I was reading that we don't hear necessarily about the foreign action. There's a lot of Thai people, for example. There was a group of Thai people who were taken by by Hamas. Qatar is the third party state where negotiations seem to go through. Israel has quite a clear line to Hamas through Qatar. Presumably every other nation does as well. It was very striking, as you said in Entebbe, that they sort of, and this is a point that Israelis have often made, they singled out the Israelis, they singled out the Jews and kept them, and they let other people go. And it points again to Israel's position, which is you've got to look after yourself because often you'll be left alone in the most perilous situation if you're Israeli. That's a view that they have about their nation and their citizens. Is it possible that other nations will get hostages out that Israelis, and there'll be a sort of the non-dual national Israelis will be left? Is that a plausible situation? And will there be negotiations going on from the Thai government? They flew to Iran, I think, the Thai government to try and get their people out.
Yeah, I mean, we should also mention that an awful lot of Thais have already lost their lives. So, the idea that Hamas are going to treat the dual nationals lightly is a bit optimistic. But what they will do is use them as bargaining chips, and they probably are going to use the release, if indeed it comes to that, of dual nationals as a means of heaping extra pressure onto Israel. In other words, this idea that there can be a drip idea of releasing the hostages, and therefore Israel should stay its hand. I mean, this is now a big PR battle going on in terms of world opinion. I mean, really, that's what it's come down to. And Israel, of course, is in an invidious position to if you look at it from their perspective, which is that they are determined to secure. Determined to their long-term security, they have based on an absolute determination to deal with Hamas once and for all. But that's much, much easier said than done. And in the meantime, of course, they are killing, as we can see, indirectly, of course, an awful lot of innocents. And that, of course, is going to, to bring down world opinion on the other side, not so much Hamas, of course, but the Palestinians more generally, which is what makes this whole situation so difficult to I've got a current so difficult to decide one way or another in your own mind. I mean, I've got a podcast at the moment about Ukraine, and that's been pretty easy for us to say who's done the wrong thing there and who we should be supporting, but it's much more difficult in this situation. And you can see that both the British and the American governments have tried to come down firmly on the side of the Israelis, because after all, they were initially attacked. But this is a thorny issue that has a long and difficult history, and as a result, the movement of world opinion one way or another really does make a big difference in all of this. The calculation for Hamas, my final feeling about the hostages, of the calculation of Hamas, how they are physically, that is, their leaders, going to get out of this, is an interesting one. And as I say, Stig, I suspect that the final use, at least for some of the hostages, is going to be literally as a human shield and a bargaining chip when push really does come to shove, which it seems like it's going to in the next few days, if not few weeks.
We talk about this a lot on my radio program, Saul. That when we speak to Palestinians, and they use the word genocide. I've had debates with people of the PLO, people who are just Palestinian citizens. You've written about all sorts of things, including, colonial abuses in India. The phrase genocide has a very specific meaning, and to me, who's not an expert, but I'm interested in language, Israel is prosecuting a war against Hamas for legitimate self-defense, but is killing innocent civilians. Now, it feels possible to me to say that killing innocent civilians is to be condemned, and it can be explored how they're doing it. But it's not genocidal to pursue a war aim that also kills lots of people. But there are Palestinians and non-Palestinians, people in the West, who say, no. If you pursue this type of indiscriminate or not sufficiently discriminate bombing campaign, you are acting in a genocidal fashion. As a historian, Saul, is this important? Because the PR war is important. The terms, language is important. What do you think?
Well, it's a subversion, really, isn't it, of the Holocaust, and it's a irresponsible use of the term, frankly. I mean, interesting enough, given my name, you might think I'm of Jewish descent. Actually, I'm of Armenian descent, and I think the Armenians and the Jews, are unfortunately the only two races that can really claim with any proper justification that genocidal acts were carried out against them. And you can debate about stuff like Rwanda, of course, too, but. No, it's a complete misuse of the term, and you can condemn what the Israeli government and military are doing without using the term genocide. I think, frankly, you and I I certainly feel very uneasy about their willingness to, in their determination to achieve a military objective, to incur civilian casualties. In the same way, by the way, Stig, that I feel about the Allied bombing campaign in the Second World War. You absolutely can see what they were trying to do, but their willingness to kill civilians along the way, I think personally feel is unacceptable. And there will probably be people coming back at me on that. But no, the term genocide is a monstrous misuse of the term, and it is trying to create some kind of moral equivalence with the Holocaust and of course with the acts of Hamas. And it's, it really shouldn't be used, and that needs to be called out every time it is.
I think that I do agree with that. The other misuse of language, though, in the other side, is collateral damage, the great softening euphemisms of war with which you'll be very familiar, which is we endlessly go around the houses on this, and so does Keir Starmer in the UK, so does Rishi Sunak, so does Joe Biden. And we have the IDF on my program, and they'll say, we're doing what we can. We're doing what we can. We say go to the south. There's a safer area. When pushed, will you say, is it a safe area? They say, no area is safe. It's a humanitarian area. Does that mean there'll be no bombs dropped? No area is safe. And I suppose the notion of international law, even, we're acting in terms of international law. None of those collateral damage, international law, have no real practical meaning, it seems to me. Because ultimately, how do you judge what is an acceptable proportional danger to civilians when you're going after a military target? So the Israel will always say we're doing it legitimately, and their critics will always say you're doing it insufficiently with discrimination. And actually, when it boils right down to it, the argument becomes fruitless because they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly right. And they are prepared to kill a certain number of civilians to achieve their military objectives. I'm not saying they want to, but they're prepared to accept that is a byproduct. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, in my mind, I think we don't know, of course, the accuracy of the reports of civilian deaths that we're getting out of Gaza, but that doesn't really matter. If we argue between 8,000 or 4,000, it's still an awful lot of innocent blood that's being spilled. That in a military objective, which in my mind is very difficult to achieve per se, and you could argue that the attempt by the Israeli military to eradicate what is in effect, albeit a government that maybe not every Palestinian agrees with, but a government of a neighboring enclave or state or would-be state is an absolutely mad enterprise, because given the concentration of civilian life in that relatively small area, no bigger than the Isle of Wight, I gather, you are, with this type of warfare, using planes, using tanks, using, what is a blunt instrument. I mean, Israel has very effective special forces, but it doesn't have enough good special forces to take out Hamas without going in there using, the heavyweight tanks and planes that it also has at its disposal. So what it seems to me is going on here is that, in best case scenario, they would use the more surgical special forces to deal with the leaders of Hamas, or the people who planned the atrocity on the 7th of October. What they're actually doing is taking, well, is it the easier option? I don't know, but they're taking the more obvious option of just going in and hammering the place so that, buildings are being destroyed and lives are being lost. And that is a so-called military objective that sits very uneasily with me, I have to say.
And that's this question that you make also about the PR war and whether or not even Hamas envisaged this. They were willing to sacrifice their people in order to provoke Israel to this extent, and who knows if that is true. One more thing on the hostages before we go. So this is they have in the past, Israel, done swaps. They've been criticized for it. I think they got one person and they gave up thousands of Palestinian prisoners in the past. The argument from Hamas is, give us all your Palestinian prisoners. Again, there's an equivalence being drawn that people in Israeli prisons are the same as hostages underground in Gaza. Many people would not accept that equivalence, but it is being drawn by Hamas. Is there any chance that pressure from the families of hostages, from public opinion in Israel, which is presumably very, very, and from people I speak to, seems to be very, very supportive of the war notionally, but very critical of Netanyahu personally, do you sense that there's any chance, or is Israel a nation that's going to go after its people to get them back much more militarily than with a big swap?
Well, as I was explaining with Entebbe, the release of hostages was an option, and it's an option they almost took. But it was condemned by Shimon Peres, who was the defense secretary at the time, defense minister. He basically said it would be a surrender, and for that reason, Stig, I can't see that happening in this instance. So egregious, so appalling was the act of October the 7th. And frankly, Netanyahu's political career is hanging by a thread now. I mean, it's amazing that he's still in power after all these years, but he is. But this really, really could do for him, unless he can find some kind of solution that allows Israel to live with itself after this. And giving up terrorists for hostages, which Israel never likes to do, but has done quite, as you point out, has done in the past, will sit after the murder, the brutal murder of 1,400 Israelis, very, very badly with the Israeli public. It's interesting because the Israeli public has generally been on the side of the families of hostages, but in this instance, I don't think that's a viable proposition, I'm afraid.
Well, listen, Saul, it's been fascinating talking through all this stuff. I mean, it's grim, and people watching it will feel how grim it is, and it's the context. The humanitarian aspect in all areas is the context we're having this discussion. But it is important to try and talk about facts on the ground as we understand them now, and also this historical context. This is not the first hostage situation Israel has lived through, and that will impact on decisions that they make. It's a great pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.